Mr. Barnes, you're representing the Industry Trade Association here in Brussels. Well, I give you the floor. You have 8 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, I'll do my best. Wave if I go too long.
Fine.
Okay, so good morning, and thanks for inviting us to speak. If I could have the second slide. Okay, this issue of transparency, it's clearly been a challenging journey for the industry, but I would like to say that we do recognise the value of sharing clinical trial information. We've always, I think, sought to assert a balanced approach where you have transparency, but you have to factor in these other considerations. Some of them are commercial, some of them are to do with the protection of the data. Next slide. So, we're committed to working with stakeholders to ensure that clinical trial information is shared responsibly, bearing in mind patient anonymity and continuing support for innovation. So again, this is the balanced approach. One thing I would emphasise here, which I think Noel put it much better than I can probably, is this isn't actually that easy to do. It's easy to ask for, but actually in terms of transforming your sort of internal system to make the data routinely available, it's not a matter of just clicking a mouse. It's not like the data is there behind some sort of mouse click and you click the mouse and the data is automatically available. This has taken a lot of work within the companies. That work is ongoing, and I think the amount of effort the companies are making does reflect the fact that there has been a change. It's clearly not as much of a change as Sheila would like to see, but I think it's a change, and it's a change that's taken place across the whole industry. Next slide. I won't dwell too much on this slide. I mean, it just refers to the legislation. I think Noel's covered that very well, but we clearly have the clinical trial regulation, and we also have the EMA policy. So I suggest we just move to the next slide because I don't want to dwell on that. You're probably aware that beyond the legislation, we actually took an initiative of our own with our sister association in Washington. And what we're trying to do is to complement what's happening through the legislation and the EMA policy and perhaps expand on it as well. So the background principles are rather similar to those which have influenced public policy. I think in our approach we've focused particularly on how to make data available for the research community, and I think that's a slightly different perspective from the EMA perspective. EMA have to consider a broader sort of constellation of stakeholders. We were particularly concerned about patients and the research community. Next slide. So the principles were focused on enhancing data sharing with researchers. We looked for a request by a qualified researcher, submission of a proposal. The companies have set up scientific review boards. We anonymise the patient level data, which is something that I'll come back to, and the data can be provided after approval of the drug. We've also worked on enhancing public access to clinical study information. Next slide. Sharing results with patients who participate in clinical trials. And I flagged that one up because even this requires work. I would emphasise that. It's probably not obvious, but if you're actually going to share public information about the results of the trial I've had the benefit of sitting in occasionally on some of the discussions about how you do that. It is not simple to do that in an informative and responsible way. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying you have to take care with it. The companies have to introduce certifying procedures, so they've told us what they're doing in order to implement these principles. And we reaffirmed our commitment to publish clinical trial results, which I think was a reflection of the previous shortcomings that Sheila referred to. Next slide. How does this work in practice? It works in different ways. On the right-hand side is, I guess, the sort of what you would imagine happens, which is that a researcher comes to a company and says, you know, I want to have access to the data. If the companies say no, then there will be an independent review of the data. But we also have data sharing taking place through partnerships. So where an academic institution and a company are working together to review the investigators' requests. And then finally, we have sort of collaborations, which are broader, where there's an access decision is made by an independent review panel. So we have some different models in terms of the oversight process. What we're doing as EFPIA is to monitor each of the individual companies. They are required to declare to us their transparency initiatives and give updates and deliverables. We've done a couple of surveys. I think I would say we're still sort of very much in the early stages of this process, but on the next slide I can give you some sort of update of where we are. So far 199 requests for data. The average is 6, although as you can see the requests are sort of heavily skewed towards some companies. 134 have been approved, 20 are pending and 31 have been denied. So at this point 75% have been approved or are pending. So in terms of where we're headed, clearly the European Union has a very strong agenda on transparency, which is, I think, you know, the subject of your discussions yesterday and today. We think the Medicines Agency is taking a significant and leading role in figuring out how to make this data available from agencies. We have, as I mentioned, this separate industry commitment, which I think is starting to work, and I suspect it will expand as academics become aware of how it works and get familiar with it. Looking to the future, a lot of this discussion has been around the idea of conventional clinical trials, which are trials that we carry out prior to medicines approval, and which are relatively highly structured. What we're clearly moving to is a world where medicines will be continuously assessed through their lifetime. So the relative balance of importance of the data generated prior to the initial approval relative to the importance of data generated from the real-world use of the medicine will shift in favour of the real-world use. And I think this is actually quite a revolution. I think in the past this wasn't done primarily because it was actually quite hard to get hold of real-world data. You know, it's part of the digital revolution. I mean, but these days increasingly that data is available. So where we go to in future is going to be very much about how do we handle that data transparency paradigm rather than the historic one. So we think enhanced transparency will serve patients, researchers, industry. Indeed, I mean, I think if you go back to where this started, I know that the past history, I think in EMA and certainly more generally of freedom of information requests, is a lot of them they come from competitors. The people who want to know the data are your competitors, and that's not just true in medicines, it's true elsewhere. So presumably this will be useful competitively. It'll also be helpful for regulators and HTA bodies. I think, you know, this is a journey that has just started. There will be a need to learn from experience and assess how things are going. Next slide. I am getting there, Martin. Okay, 2 minutes. Second, just to change the subject slightly, but just so you're aware of it, this transparency journey for us, we're conscious of it's something that's a challenge for the industry. And the other big piece that we're working on at the moment is financial transparency in terms of our relationships with healthcare professionals. So we have a code of conduct which is going live 1st of January next year. It has been, trying to think, at least 3 years in the building. And again, it's a work in progress. It will apply across the whole of the EFPIA membership. And similar initiatives are taking place in the US and in Australia. Finally, and very quickly, just to say, along with making data available, I would take people back to the importance of education. We have developed some materials on our site just to explain to people what clinical trials are, how they're conducted. And I think it's important that there is an education component of what we do along with the transparency. Thank you.